This is Apollo Control Houston at 110 hours, 1 minute ground elapsed time. The change of shift news conference is ready to begin in the large auditorium of Building 1, and at this time we will take down the live air to ground and switch to the news conference. This is Apollo Control Houston.
We just sort of skimmed down through the events leading up to touchdown and through the 8 hours of the shift.
Okay, when my team came on this morning, we started out rather uneventfully. We had gotten through the night with some good plans laid out for the ascent battery checkout, which you probably monitored that when we did check those out during the activation, things worked well. And we all were ready for a nice, easy day. And it turned out not to be quite so easy to get us down to the surface. The big problem that we spent most of the time on during the shift was evidently a contamination problem in the abort switch, which kept giving a signal to the LEM guidance computer indicating that button had been depressed. And of course, if this occurred during the descent to the surface, it would inadvertently put us into an abort situation when it didn't really intend for it to happen. So we cranked up a capability that I think truly is astounding. It amazes me. I know sitting at the flight director console, there's a lot of activity goes on in this building and in the control center, and you hear a lot of that, but let me assure you, that's like the whole thing's like an iceberg. You see a big operation over there in Building 30, but the people that support us and the people that are behind us outnumber us by a large number. Now, when we had this problem, what it really required is that we virtually rewrite some of the program logic in the descent program. That's program 63. And the people from MIT, both people that were on site here and people up at their facility, people from Grumman, and our own people here at MSC all pitched in, and in a period of about 4 hours did a fantastic job, I think, of getting us around a very serious problem, one we had not thought we'd ever cope with. So as a result, we never had worked out any procedures for it. These procedures came strictly from scratch. We actually came up with one procedure that we later went back and redid. And we read that procedure to the crew on just about LOS of the rev prior to PDI, I think. And during the backside pass, some of the experts got to looking at a little better way to do it. So that's what we read up to them at acquisition. I also, and I will do it when I see them, I also want to take my hat off to the crew, because they accepted what we gave to them, and it was obvious they understood exactly the steps to take and what we were trying to tell them to do. So I think there's a real show of capability on their part, too. They understood what to do, and they did it exactly as we read it to them. The descent itself, after we got past the procedure, had another little wrinkle in it, in that we were a little late getting the landing radar to lock in. I don't know what the problem or what caused that, but it was a little late. It was nowhere near an abort limit, but it did startle us a bit, and that's why you heard us ask him to cycle the landing radar circuit breaker during the descent. That merely takes power off the landing radar and then gives it a chance to lock on again. Well, shortly after that, what was it, Dick, 20 seconds? 20 seconds after we cycled the breaker, the landing radar did lock in. And we don't know whether that was because we cycled a breaker or whether it was just finally had gotten to the point where it was ready to lock in. It kind of has a mind of its own. But we did put in the downrange noun 69. So for you that aren't familiar with that term, that's just our actual initial target was off by 2,800 feet. We put that in, and when he pitched over, he was right on the money. As far as I know, he did not do any LPD, landing point designations. I don't think he did any of those. I think he was right on target. He took it over at about 500 feet manually. He landed prior to the 30-second remaining call, which is 30 seconds to bingo. So I would estimate, and I know it'll come up, I'll estimate he had somewhere on the order of about a minute's worth of fuel left when he touched down. The primary guidance and navigation system showed a location on the moon of 3.65 degrees south, pardon me, and 17.51 degrees west as a landing point. Now that will be further refined as we do get into the description. The geologist will probably pin that down to exactly what crater they're right beside. They're going into a normal lunar stay situation right now, and as far as I know, everything's going just fine. It was when we left the control center. I'd like to kind of close my commentary once again emphasizing that I think the capability that we showed today, I'm very proud to be a part of it. The capability that of these MIT people, the Grumman people, the astronauts, the people that run the trainers, our own engineers here, our program office people, and our own flight control people really showed its true worth to me today, and I think it's a big plus for manned spaceflight. I'm going to let Dick tell you a little bit about what this fix or rewrite to the procedure that we did, what it entailed. He's not going to go into a great amount of detail, but Dick, why don't you just kind of tell him what we did?
Okay. As you know, as Jerry explained, the bit that could have been inadvertently set as it was being set the 2 passes prior to the PDI rev, if the LGC had monitored this bit, an abort would have been performed automatically. So the procedure that was used was to go into the LGC prior to ignition and tell the LGC that you really weren't in an abort monitor situation. In other words, we told the LGC that you were in to do a normal burn, not a P63 type burn, which is a landing program burn. So once it was told to ignore any abort discrete or bit as was being set inadvertently, the ignition took place and the crew then throttled up manually in 26 seconds, which the LGC would normally, the computer would normally do under its own guidance. Then after this took place, and the crew essentially is now burning in an attitude hold mode at maximum throttle, they went in and told the LGC, okay, now just ignore this 1 bit, rather than to think you're in a program where you never monitor this bit. They just had it believe that it should ignore this bit. Then one additional step was needed, and that was to go in and tell the LGC, okay, you're now in a landing program, and to accept landing radar data. So there were essentially a number of steps that had to be taken, and they were taken in a leisurely fashion, and the burn proceeded nominally, as we saw. And I think that's it, Jay.
Okay, and as long as there was, I forgot one guy, he just walked up here, that made a big difference in all of this is Fred Hayes, who I thought really took all the inputs from a lot of people and sifted through them real well and got them up to the crew, and they understood it. And hats off to you too, Fred. And I guess we're ready to go to questions.
Okay, please wait for the microphone and identify yourself. Okay, John Lannon over here. Second row, John Lannon right there.
With those coordinates, Jerry, where does that put the spacecraft in relation to the doublet, triplet craters?
Fred, can you answer that? It's just north of the northern crater, I think. And about
Yeah, well, I can't answer that with respect to coordinates because I didn't even bother looking at those relative to the map. But relative to Al's comment, they said they were moving just over the north crater of Triplet, which would put them essentially between Triplet and Doublet. And halfway between those two features was the desired landing site. So they're probably a little bit short of the real X on the ground, but in terms of doing the EVAs, it's still a very good position.
Henry Simmons, didn't you have a question? Go ahead.
I'd like to ask about the landing radar. On the transcript, Ed kept calling for it to come in at 32,000, and it seemed to be a very long time before it did come in. At what altitude did it fire up, and how far could you have gone without it?
I think it came in finally at around 22,000 feet, and we can go down to 10,000 before we have to abort if we don't have landing radar. So I think it was 22 or maybe 23,000, somewhere in that order.
Mark Bloom?
Jerry, excuse me, do you think you could reconstruct in a little bit more detail, I don't know if you have your notes with you, but if you do, just when you saw that you had a problem with this possible abort, and just what you did from there, what the people did from there, how you got this information from MIT, how you got it to them?
Gee, I can't remember the exact time that Dick here is the one that called me on it the first time. He said, we've got a bit set in the computer. It looks like that it's received the in bit for an abort. It must have been
30 minutes into the pass, first pass.
It was about 30 minutes into the first pass.
Undocking pass, yeah.
In fact, he's saying the rev that we undocked on. So as soon as we got it, we first had him go through a procedure, and this was on our own here now, with Dick here primarily calling the shots. We had him go through a procedure to call up that bit on the computer so he could also see it, and we had him push engine stop, and then we had him press the abort button and reset it, and that reset the bit okay. And it was probably the actuation of that switch, just pushing it in and out, that cleared whatever was there. So we went on the rest of that rev without much thought about it, because we had other things to do in the activation. We were trying to get undocked, which worked well. Incidentally, I didn't even mention that. Undocking was normal. So then on the back side, as soon as we had LOS, then we started talking about it, and we realized the seriousness of the thing that it could have caused had we not been able to work around it. At acquisition on that rev, and of course at this time the wheels started in motion while we were on the back side.
What do you do?
Well, that loop generally runs something like Dick goes to his backroom support people and talks to them, and at the same time he talks to an area we call SPAN, Spacecraft Analysis, which the contractors and the program office pretty well monitor. So the wheel started in motion then, and what could have caused it? Because we really thought at least my feeling was, well, we probably have cleared it now. Whatever it was, we've cleared, but now what could have caused it? So at acquisition, that feeling went away very rapidly, because Dick called me again and said the bit was reset again. And that was the time that we called him and told him, rather than going through this procedure, let's hit the panel, tap on the panel, and see if there is something like a solder ball or something like that in there, if we could move it. And he did, and sure enough he did move it. And I don't know how many other times we had him tap it, probably 2 or 3 more.
3 or 4.
After that. And so it was obviously something in the switch that was loose and getting across the contacts. And then we knew for sure, after we had seen the bit at acquisition the second time, we knew then for sure that we did have a contamination problem that we were going to have to work around. And at that time, the trainers at the Cape, the trainers here, the simulator at MIT were all put into use. Several procedures were tried out, and the one that we finally zeroed in on, which was the second one we read to them, was the one we used. And that's kind of the chronological. I'll say this, it was about PDI minus 15 minutes, or minus 10 minutes, when Gene Cernan handed me a note that the final procedure had been verified at the Cape. So it was kind of close, got down close to the wire there. That procedure had already been run at MIT in their simulator, but it had not been run in a CMS, or an LMS rather.
I don't mean to tie it up, but it's fascinating to me. Could Dick tell yours? Could you tell how it occurred to you, what you went through, and so forth?
Okay, well, this particular switch has a number of indications when it gets set, and this was about the midway through the undocking pass, right after we'd undocked, and I got one indication on the console. One of the indications came on, which was the indication to the LGC only. And then we went through all the normal procedures to verify that the ground was receiving it properly and there was not a software problem on the ground. And once that had been verified, we started working then and thought that it was truly in the spacecraft. And then we went into the procedure that Jerry explained to you.
Okay. Is this still one question, Mark? There's several others waiting here. Take this one over here. Okay, have at it.
Okay, I went to my man in the back. Go ahead.
We want in detail, if you can, what went on.
Okay, like Jerry explained, I went to my man in the back room who's monitoring this, and he verified it and verified it in the ground station here, then went to the remote site, verified it there.
That's just making sure it's a true indication at the site.
And from that point on, he then went to SPAN, what Jerry had mentioned before was the contractor support, started them working on it in that regards. The software people then, who he's also in contact with, started working on it, and by that way it went to MIT. And at the same time then I went to Jerry and started working on the procedure to reset it on board if possible. At that time we did not know what set it, whether it was contamination or some other phenomena that we weren't aware of at the time. There were other coincidences at the time. We were having trouble with the S-band, this type of thing, and the computer had a error code which we normally get after the ground has uplinked some commands. So there were a lot of unknowns there, and we didn't really know until we went through the procedure, and it looked very suspiciously at that time like it was contamination, but we didn't know for sure. And we ran that data back another time, and again it left some doubt in it, and the doubt was erased very quickly when the next pass, because AOS, because the bit was set again. And this time we were going to go through the same procedure again, and we had an input from the back room. Why don't we try to hit the panel and see if we can dislodge it, if it is contamination? So we went to that procedure, and sure enough it did. And
I can remember Fred saying that's some kind of call-up instruction is to hit the panel, which we did, and it worked.
Okay, over here, third row.
Two-part question. First of all, did the spurious bit actually show up during PDI? And secondly, might the alterations in the computer program that were put in during PDI have had an effect on the landing radar?
The answer to your first question is no, and the answer to the second one is no. The bit didn't occur, and we thought that might be the case. If I understood, Jim McDivitt gave me an input that was, I didn't have time enough to really go into detail, but the way the switch is arranged, I think is what he told me is that if there was a contaminant in there, that it should fall to the, when it went to the G side of the switch, that it was away from the contacts. And we didn't see that bit set. The second part, no, the program was verified that we would not, by making that change, inhibit any landing radar. If we, and I don't think that doesn't have anything to do with the late landing radar lock that we got.
Zach Strickland.
Dick, will you replay that thing all over again for me? The original question about how this reprogram worked. Did you, in effect, the computer was ticking away until you reached the bit that was to cause you problems? You bypassed the computer, he flew it manually for a while, and then the computer came back in? Is that oversimplifying it?
it was essentially a simple procedure in that the computer acted like it was doing a normal burn. That is, a burn where it did not have to throttle up anything like this. It just burned in one direction. And all that was done was to accomplish this was to tell the computer, in one portion of the computer, that do not start this routine that looks for this bit.
Which is the abort routine.
Which is the abort routine. And so once you've told it that, you had to, of course, go into a program, a sub-program in this respect, you might call it, or a subroutine, as it turned out, what they did here, and told it not to monitor for any abort bits. Okay. Then once you started into the program, of course, we had to, or start into the burn, of course, we had to get the landing guidance enabled. And to do this, you'd had to tell it it was in the right program, which does have a monitor abort bit routine in it. So then, before we could do that, we had to then go in and tell the computer to ignore that particular bit.
In case it came up.
In case it did come up. And then, of course, you had to re-enable the guidance. Now, I think one thing that has not been mentioned, Jerry, and that this particular procedure allowed the crew to fly a nominal, actually a nominal ignition sequence, other than the fact they throttled up manually at 26 seconds. And whereas other procedures would not have been this straightforward.
Bruce Hicks.
How much time does it have from PDI until the until the computer came back into operation and ignored everything?
The beauty of the LGC is that it always keeps track of what's happening insofar as the delta V that you've got. So when they went back into guidance after throttle up, the LGC had retained all this information and then put it to use in its guidance programs. And that zeroed the guidance right back to where it would have been if it had been performing the guidance all along. So everything was nominal from there on. Throttle down came on time, just like the whole ignition sequence had been automatic.
Okay, Mary Bub.
Jerry, suppose you hadn't noticed this little goodie so long ahead and hadn't had time to fiddle around with your program. What would you have done? Would you have let the crew fly it in manually and bypass the automatic program, or would you have stayed in orbit longer, delayed your landing, or what?
Well, Mary, it depends on when you saw it. Now, if you never saw it, of course, you would go right into the sequence, normal sequence, and it could have caused an inadvertent abort. If we saw it, say for instance, on the PDI rev, but prior to PDI, I suspect we would have waved off and gone around and tried for the PDI on the next rev, and in the meantime pulled ourselves together with the procedure. In fact, we might could have even gone another PDI after another rev after that, and we were set up to do that. Not necessarily for this reason, but we're always looking ahead to going on subsequent PDI revs if there's something crops up at the beginning of the PDI rev that we don't understand. So it would depend on where it occurred. If it occurred close enough to PDI that we couldn't get it solved, we would slip it. We would wave off and go around. And I suspect that's what we would have done.
Okay, go ahead, front row, and then John Lannon.
Did you have the direct command override capability of that abort, such as you do on the landing radar? Do you have a capability there for a command override? If so, would you have had a secondary system that could have called for the abort if, in effect, it had really been necessary? If the answer to both of those is no, what if you had had an abort call during the descent? Would you have had any way to have known it?
Yeah, if we had had to abort, the procedure that we had set up is that we would have just gone to AGS, because the AGS system was perfectly normal. We would have gone to AGS and aborted. Now, the PINGS is still navigating. The primary guidance nav is still navigating, so it knows where it is. We would have aborted on the AGS, and then we would have gone back into the computer and re-enabled this bit that we had disabled. And then we could have switched the system over to PINGS and we could have steered into insertion with a PINGS system. Now, of course, we still always had the manual abort capability, which is an attitude hole with a window profile, and that's a more gross abort. But we still had, I guess you could really say, about 3 ways to abort, had we had to.
Capability for a direct command override of the abort system without having to go through this sequence if it became necessary? Could you directly override it?
I'm not sure I follow your question. We had a way to abort without using the pings, yes.
Necessarily mean abort. I meant if this had shown up, let's say, and you had known nothing was wrong, could you have directly overridden it? The comparison I'm thinking of here is in the landing radar. I understood that it could be immediately overridden by command override. Could you have done the same thing to the abort system? Just annihilate it, more or less.
Yeah, I think the question, maybe I understand it better, you're asking, you can inhibit the landing radar. For Apollo 14's guidance system, no, you cannot, other than the procedure we used, override. If for some inadvertent reason that bit got set going downhill, you're going to find yourself in the abort program and it's going to be commanding full throttle. Now, we do have a fix that had already been made for Apollo 15 and subs, where we put a whole bunch of bit protection devices in, and you had that capability to do that a little easier. But again, same case would apply there. If they're going downhill, then you're kind of committed, and it's going to
It'll switch you to P7.
switch to another program, the abort program, and command full throttle.
Okay, over here about the 6th row back.
I'm interested in the biomedical sensors. The day before yesterday, I think, there was something wrong with one of them in the case of Shepard. Yesterday, we heard that perhaps Mitchell was going to change his harness. Now, I would like to know how these sensors are working, and if you have any data as far as the heartbeats are concerned during the descent to the moon.
I'll have to ask you again what you said at the end, but Ed Mitchell did change his harness, and it was working correctly the last time we saw it. Now, in the LEM, you can only monitor one biomed at a time, and for the descent, the monitor was on Al Shepard, and his rates were very low, like in the 80s, and which indicates he was pretty cool, I guess. When I left, and I think on the surface right after they land, sometime in there they make a selection of which way to put the biomed, and I suspect that it'll probably go over to Ed for a while, and we'll get a look at what he's doing. Did I answer all your question?
Yes.
Okay.
John Lannon.
I have a quickie for each of you. Jerry, if you had to go to successive passes, how far would each one have put you from the landing site?
We could have gotten to the same landing site, John. In other words, our guidance and propulsion capability was enough for 2 revs for sure, and probably a 3rd rev. We could still steer out the cross range that we needed to in order to get back to the original landing site.
And for Fred, there was an interchange right around that first pass where somebody said something to Mitchell about him being a great button pusher or a great... was that the first reference to this problem?
Yeah, that was... I was complimenting Ed on our first attempt at that very exotic procedure of beating on the panel. That he did a good job beating on the panel because the bit got reset.
Final one for Dick. How long would it normally take a programmer to hammer out a new program of this type were he to sit happily up in Cambridge and do it at his leisure?
I should refuse to answer that.
It might take him weeks.
No, I really don't have an answer for that. Actually, it's one of those things I think you know what you're looking for. And in the software programming, I'm not very familiar with the software in that aspect and programming and that type of thing, but I know that if you can identify the problem, you can attack it much faster than when you're trying to write a program error-free, if you know what I'm speaking of.
Over here, I believe, is next. 3rd row back. The guy with his hand up.
Do you foresee having to worry about the computer at all prior to liftoff? Might you have to feed it anything new before that?
I asked that question right at the end of my shift, and I think there are people who are going to look at that, but the first answer that we had was that there wouldn't be any problem as soon as we got out of the P-60 series. And is that still hold true? Because, of course, now we had the trouble with the abort button, and coming off the surface, you abort stage, which is another button entirely. And I think that's about right, isn't it, Dick?
Yes, and in fact, the abort stage is not monitored, other than it sets some hardware which gives us redundancy for the ascent engine hardware. The two discretes, abort and abort stage, are not monitored at all in P-12.
Reg Turtle.
Jerry, you said it was TEI minus 10 when you had the procedure finally verified. How many minutes PDI? How many minutes were left before PDI when the information was finally passed to Ed Mitchell?
We passed it at about 30 minutes prior. And, isn't that right, Fred? We got acquisition about 36 minutes prior to PDI as he comes around the corner. And I think by probably 30 minutes or maybe 25 minutes prior to PDI, we had passed all the numbers up to him. And as I say, we felt certain we had the right procedure because it had been run at MIT, and we wanted to run it in one of the trainers. And that final confirmation came in around 10 minutes prior to ignition.
Art Hill.
Jerry, would you run over the comparison of the time they took to get to the surface versus the predicted time? And does it seem to you as if there was any great amount of hovering that was done before selecting a place to land?
No. As a matter of fact, from the time he took over P-66, which is where he goes manual, until he landed, I think was just about, probably 90% of our successful simulations where it was a profile very much like that. That is, he'd take over and then go down to something like 150 feet or so and really find the place he wanted and then start down again. And that was almost, to me, Fred, I don't know how it seemed to you, it seemed right by the book. And as I mentioned, I think you weren't here, he had on the order of about a minute propellant left when he touched down. That number can be tweaked up for you later, but it's something like a minute.
That's not the comparison I had in mind. What were you predicting for the length of the burn to touchdown before PDI versus what actually took place?
You remember what it was?
Well, I have to say this, that it was as close to nominal as we could expect it. Throttle down came within a second or two in which we've practiced with in simulations, and it actually occurred tonight.
And Art, to answer your question, I'm not sure any of the three of us can tell you what the scheduled time from PDI ignition is down to touchdown, because that assumes an auto landing all the way, which we never do, because the crew takes it over. So that's not a number we even are aware of. I can find it out for you if you want to hang around.